As Paul Beckwith mentioned in last week's episode, we have to stop our fossil fuel emissions. You may also recall that I asked Beckwith how he felt about initiatives such as a carbon tax. This strategy aimed at the large goal of slashing emissions is one that hasn't gotten a lot of media play, but one that could once again pump the brakes on our accelerating push towards ecological, economic, and political suicide. And indeed, carbon pricing could also assist in the realm of a guaranteed income. Late last week, I sat down with local DC activist Camila Thorndike to talk about her work in fighting for carbon pricing, the specifics of the campaign, and also the importance of pointed local activism, particularly with things like the People's Climate March right around the corner. Take a look.
So I refer to carbon pricing as an overarching term encompassing both a carbon tax, which is called a carbon fee if you're not collecting revenue for government purposes, and also a cap and trade system. So both cap and trade and a carbon tax, if they're designed well, have the same outcome of making polluters pay for the true costs of pollution.
And talk about how that works, because on a local level, because obviously you're working for the DC carbon price. How does that work with, multinational corporations working inside a local area? Does it apply to them or just local businesses that are based here? How does that work inside the confines of a place like DC?
Sure. So we wouldn't be taxing businesses directly. The idea is to cover all segments of the economy at the first point of sale as dirty energy enters the district. So they're firms in DC, whether they're local businesses or those multinationals, they're purchasing those products, the electricity or the heating and cooling needs or transportation fuels. So they will see an increased price for those energy sources if they're dirty energy sources. Mm-hmm. The clean energy options will not have any fee levied on them. So that's how it works, is it's incentivizing them to switch over.
And what is the price that you're looking at, and where would the money go?
So we're looking at a $20 per ton fee the first year that would increase $10 every year. That's a very abstract number to most folks. You can imagine $1 per ton of carbon pollution translates to about 1 cent increase in the cost of a gallon of gas. So it's really not very much at all if you consider how much, for instance, the cost of gas wildly swings, by multiple dollars sometimes within a 1 year period. In DC, I should note, we're not sure exactly if we're going to be levying the carbon fee on gasoline. It's a pretty small portion of the overall pollution pie. We might want to do something around parking or incentivizing metro. It's just a little asterisk there. You asked where the revenue goes. That's always the most contentious part of a carbon pricing policy. So the principles of the campaign and the 23 organizations that are part of the coalition are centered around fairness, justice, however you want to frame it, and then the scientific integrity and the economic integrity of the policy. So to break that down, 80% of the revenue is going back to DC residents in the form of a regular rebate check or EBT or debit card. And then 20% is being reserved for a representative stakeholder body of businesses and low-income advocates and labor and any number of other interests in the city to collaboratively make recommendations for where those revenues should go year after year. That could be to supporting small business, who will definitely deserve that revenue cushion, or metro, or energy efficiency programs, whatever it might be.
Interesting. So it's almost like you're creating the space for not like a guaranteed income, but a way for poor people to try and get themselves out of the necessary confines of a capitalist oppressive system.
Definitely. I mean, this is actually, we're hoping, the beginnings of a universal basic income. And that's another stream that's feeding into this river, that we really want there to be an example of basically accounting for the shared assets, the common good of the planet. It shouldn't be that private industry gets to just take what they want, privatize the profits and socialize the losses. Leave us all bearing the costs of climate change. If you instead make them pay with a price on carbon, you level the playing field for things that are better for us, and you generate that revenue, which can then go to compensate people for the damages of climate change, especially those who've been hit the first and worst, which tend to be low-income people, communities of color, and certainly future generations.
So let's talk about those industries real quick, because at this point, there's sort of like a negative. I spoke with a climate system scientist a while back, and he said what we have now is like a negative carbon tax because we subsidize big oil and gas and these dirty industries for we pay them to poison us is essentially what we're doing. So if that were to stay in place, because this is a localized effort, is there some sort of, is it part of that to take away the subsidies as well as implement the carbon tax, or is that sort of a separate fight? And if so, how did, like, are those two gonna, like, are we gonna end up breaking even with that?
That's such a great question. Right now, we are directly subsidizing the fossil fuel industry through those taxpayer dollars, but we're also indirectly subsidizing them when we again pay for the costs of cleanup for their business costs, which they should be responsible for. And, that's in the tens of billions of dollars every year now, or, hundreds of thousands of deaths. So the answer to your question is that they go hand in hand. What you really want is to zero out the subsidies and have a price on carbon, because the true cost of carbon is really quite high and going up with every moment of inaction. It's not one or the other. You want to just tackle whatever's politically feasible, I think, in the moment. And then both would transition the marketplace. However, I think the one we should start with is really a price on carbon, because as it rolls out, you are eating into the subsidy.
So talk about the importance of DC, because DC is such an interesting place, because it's not only a city, should technically be a state as well, and it's the capital of the country. Talk about that interesting, that unique perspective, and also the importance of passing something like this in the country's capital.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm here doing it, because it's so exciting, the symbolism of it, right? It's not just that we would be improving the quality of life for residents and decreasing emissions, but we'd send an incredibly powerful message throughout the country and the world, especially right now. If we could send carbon-priced electricity to the White House right under Donald Trump's nose, whether or not he wants it, that just gives me the chills, because it's not only a symbol of Americans doing what we want to do and what we're prevented from doing because of the power of the industry and their elected politicians, or their bought-off politicians rather. But I think it's especially poignant in DC, given the long-standing struggle for statehood and the disenfranchisement, which people are not even aware exists within our own country. I mean, we have more people living in DC than in Vermont and certainly Wyoming, and we don't have a vote in Congress. That's outrageous.
So with that in mind, is there a chance, because I know that DC has a history of things getting shut down, like DC tried to legalize marijuana long before it actually got to the point where it is now. Is there a chance that the carbon price initiative will pass and then Congress tries to do something to ultimately make that unavailable? Yes,
there is. Our first hurdle is getting it through the council, and then all budgetary related policies passed in DC are subject to congressional review. The numbers are on our side. There's only been a few policies that have ever been meddled with in the last several decades. The marijuana example is interesting because it's still legal. It's just that the funding element of the program was compromised. Even if there's a hold on the program, enough momentum has built across the country that the fight alone for this policy, with the involvement of all national groups who are also headquartered here, would be worth having, especially as Congress and even the White House consider carbon pricing, despite the circumstances we're under right now.
So I want to switch now because the People's Climate March is coming up. And there's been, there's a lot of back and forth among seasoned activists and noobs alike. This sort of idea that it's just a bunch of people walking down the street, and the first climate march had everybody from people that were pro-fracking, like, oh, it's a gateway towards green energy, and then you had, far leftists advocating, pogo sticking across the country instead of flying. So it was just like a mess of a mess of messaging, and there wasn't really like a pointed ask or a pointed demand. Talk about what your thoughts on that towards the upcoming People's Climate March here in DC, and also like in that same vein, the importance of these localized fights, like what CCAN is doing.
Yes, such a great question. I'd say my views over the years on the point of mass mobilizations has gotten more complicated. As from the standpoint of someone who's working in DC for a specific policy, if done right, this mobilization could actually have a wonderful outcome for us. And much like the march in New York actually did help form a coalition and push one strong climate policy through the New York Assembly, there could be real legislative outcomes, but you have to focus on that. And so, I've been really impressed by the PCM organizing team and how they're thinking about not just the flash in the pan kind of event, but how does the organizing before and then most importantly after actually strengthen and cross-pollinate and direct people towards actionable outcomes, because you can have a big show of support, but then the carbon in the atmosphere doesn't really care about that. Like, we actually have to pass policies.
Yeah. So with that, I'm also curious, because a lot of people are going to come to DC, and there have been people saying like, oh, don't go to DC, stay in your own community and work. What is your perspective on that? Like, should people go out of their way to get to DC and be a part of the climate march here, or try and take that day, that National Day of Action, and start building something in their own community, like a pointed campaign?
It's a good question. I mean, having organized for many years on the West Coast, I got pretty fatigued of all this stuff going on in DC and on the East Coast, and it's a huge it can be a huge sacrifice of time and resources to make that big trip. That said, a lot of my activism started when I went out for my first conferences in DC, and you get that energy and you start connecting with folks and you feel truly a part of a movement that's so much bigger than yourself. So I think that's for every individual to decide. I know a lot of groups that are going to make really good use of that day in their own communities.
But either way, the important thing, if you do come to DC, the important thing is to take something back with you.
Definitely.
To learn more about Camila's work and the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, visit ChesapeakeClimate.org.